So, continuing on the theme, sort of adapting and pivoting and how that all plays. And the other big show event that was taking place this week was Snowflake's Summit 2025. And I'm not a big data guy, I'm not a big data guy, and so this is not my core expertise area. So I'll let you sort of chime in. But what I will say this, just on the surface. When I went through everything that they announced, the thing that struck me is that it is indicative of a trend that we've been seeing recently, where we're moving away from the broad, grandiose sort of announcements around AI into much more pragmatic, much more narrow, and I think probably in the end, much more applicable and meaningful uses of AI across all of this. And I think that was my big takeaway because and this is sort of sounds backwards, because I'm not a big data guy. I looked at this and most of this sort of went right over my head. It's like, oh, there's all these applications of AI in these very narrow bands that are in the weeds. And so I'm curious your take on how useful and interesting these were from your perspective. But from a macro level, I think that's sort of the state that we're starting to reach.
Yeah, what stood out to me for Snowflake Summit is, so I just talked about how in FinOps, they moved from more ESG based reporting to talking about AI this year. For Snowflake, I feel like last year they talked about all about AI and their Cortex agents and their ability to bring AI to the data. And this year it was really all about very tactical capabilities. So they broadcast capabilities around making their Iceberg data lake more Snowflake ready, working on their data migrations, of course, wanting to suck all that data out of everybody else's platforms and bring them into Snowflake. They broadcast their intelligence product, which is really a business intelligence product driven by natural language, kind of in the same boat as Tableau and Click, I would say, as well as building this Cortex AISQL, which is basically using a SQL-like interface for AI. So at the end of the day, the big announcements were about providing business intelligence and a SQL-like capability to negotiate and work with Snowflake's capabilities. Back to the future.
Yeah. Okay. Let's double click on two things. One that you brought up, and one you didn't, and I'm curious both on both counts. One is the sequel one. I read that one. I run through it, and it was like it was baffling to me. I mean, I understand that SQL is like the language of data, but
I
but
love
at A,
SQL.
well, and that's fine. I can write a SQL query as well, probably not as well as an XI, but like I get it. Uh, but it's also, there's a whole motion right now, increasingly, especially driven by AI, of moving away from these sort of SQL-based relational driven data structures, because we have to deal with all these different disparate sort of data sources now. And I'm not saying for a minute that that's going away, but I find it interesting that they went down this road of sort of applying AI within the container of SQL versus the other way, which although they sort of did, because they have I forget what they call it, calling it Snowflake's intelligence, which is sort of the other end of it, which is basically this conversational interface to query your data or to talk about your data, which I guess would be bypassing the SQL piece. So it was just really kind of fascinating to me that they sort of attacked it from both angles and are not sort of abandoning or attempting to abandon the whole SQL foundation. So that was the first. I'm curious what your take on that, and then I'll get to the other one in a minute. But just to the one you didn't mention was the Snowflake OpenFlow, which I actually found quite fascinating. But what's your take on the SQL? Why the focus there?
I my my hypothesis, my guess is Snowflake has been finding that AI all by itself is too vague to support the deterministic queries that you want to have in place. But standard SQL isn't open enough to take advantage of the flexibility of AI when you're asking these more open-ended queries. And you need something in the middle that can focus the AI a little bit more from a functional perspective, yet while being more programmatic in nature, something where you can kind of predict what kind of AI capability the the agent in question is going to approach without necessarily having to type it all out. So I see this as a middle ground to be able to guide AI queries and questions a little bit more in a more structured fashion, and perhaps be able to get more deterministic data outputs and
So
inputs.
I don't know. That sounds like maybe if you're not talking to Snowflake from a product marketing perspective, given that that's your path, maybe you should be, because you did such a better job of explaining why that had a place in their product lineup than their press release did. I mean,
I've
that
heard
made
that
perfect
product marketing is a thing, Charlie.
that made perfect sense to me. Okay, I get it. I got it. That works. All right. So the other one that I mentioned, and I'm curious your take on it, was Snowflake OpenFlow, and mostly because it this idea that it's an open, extensible, multimodal, which I think is pretty critical, data ingestion approach. And this is obviously something that they've always been focused on, but really sort of, I think, ratcheting this up into really trying to own this end to end. I mean, what was your take on this? It felt very meaningful, but it also didn't seem to get a ton of airplay on this. So I'm curious if what your read on it was.
Yeah, I saw this as one of several efforts that Snowflake was making to make it easier to bring data into Snowflake. So the combination of OpenFlow, which is data type specific, to basically allow Snowflake to draw data from any specific data type in an undifferentiated fashion. That is obviously going to be very important for Snowflake to bring in more data. And I also thought the Snow Convert AI capability, which brings in data migrations from the likes of Greenplum and Netezza, the old school stuff, is also going to be an important piece of the puzzle. Snowflake is obviously trying to grab as much data as possible because they know they do a fantastic job of working with structured data and supporting those analytics in a performing cost effective from a compute perspective way.
Yeah, so interesting. I think overall good news, particularly if you're a dyed-in-the-wool hardcore data person. I think what the Snowflake is doing is very relevant and meaningful. What